Welcome everyone to the Reliability First Entity Learning Center. Today we're going to be discussing grid reliability and the strategic initiatives surrounding grid reliability in the management practices. Our Entity Learning Center offers courses for all of our entities. It's located on the Reliability First website. And if you have any questions or comments regarding our training, please direct those to Tammy Weaver at rfirst.org. We hope you enjoy this learning module and provide feedback as we're interested in continuous improvement. Welcome everyone to our Learning Objective 1. This is one of a three-part learning objective making up the Grid Reliability Strategic Initiative Model. My name is Ellen Oswald, and my co-presenter is David Sopata.
Hello, everybody.
Together, we have several years of electric utility and cybersecurity experience. Today, we're going to be reviewing management practices that are known as strategic initiatives. They include the reliability quality management, measurement and analysis, structured decision-making, risk management, and external interdependencies. At the end of this learning, we will ask you to fill out a survey and when you complete this module, and don't forget about continuing education hours. As mentioned, the strategic initiative model consists of three learning objectives. We have our learning objective, our first objective, is to look at the in-depth look at strategic initiative management practices. That's the learning objective that we have for today, right now. We also have learning objective 2, which is shorter, and that looks over the business unit assets, processes to the management practices. And our third learning objective is to review specific activities versus the generic activities. Our learning objective for today, for this module, is to gain an understanding of the strategic initiatives group of the management practices and be able to respond to questions regarding the specific activities associated with each management practice. As mentioned previously, there are 5 management practices that we've grouped together known as strategic initiatives. These 5 management practices all have a common theme in that they are achieving an organizational goal through a common methodology. From the Grid Reliability Improvement Performance Model, known as GRIPM, each of these 5 management practices are defined. They're up on your screen right now, so I'll let you take a minute and review each of these high-level definitions. All right, we'll keep moving on. If you need more time, please look at the Entity Learning Center, and you can look at the GRIPM for more detail. Today, as we walk through these strategic initiatives and the management practices related to them, we are going to be reviewing examples. David will cover a SIP example using vulnerability assessment example, and I will cover a 693 using a system restoration plan example. For consistency, we're going to use the same example for all the management practices so that we can see how they are applied. David and I will alternate the review of each management practice, starting with our discussion on the vulnerability assessment, and then our next management practice will review the system restoration example. At the end, you'll see that we have examples for each of these areas, the system restoration example and the SIP example, the vulnerability assessment example. And you can cover these in the slide deck and review them later if you choose. Our first management practice that we're going to look at will be reliability quality management, and I'll hand this over to David so he can lead our discussion.
Thank you, Ellen. So as Ellen mentioned, the first one we're going to be looking at today is reliability quality management. So this is one of the things is basically to look at the quality management of your process within your organization. As Ellen had mentioned before, we're going to be looking at two examples. As we sort of move back and forth, I'll probably be covering more of the cyber vulnerability asset program because that's what I can talk to you the best. Ellen will be covering the restoration plan, and this particular management practice is really about ensuring that you have a good quality processes in place, specifically geared towards reliability. So if you look at Act 1.1, which is the first activity within the management practice area, you'll see that the first one is identify business processes associated with reliability. So the idea behind this is you would more than likely gather some of your stakeholders together and some of your business units, and you would try to identify within your organization what are the processes that are mostly associated with reliability or are very important to reliability. So one of the things for this example that we came to, and this would be an example of a sample someone would provide to us for a business process, and we'll get to some of the scoping in some of the later examples within another learning module. And what we'll do here is talk through these particular acts and sort of walk through what we're kind of looking at and some of the things and questions that may be asked during a possible appraisal assessment. So when you're asked to identify business processes associated with reliability, the idea would have been that you got those people in the room, you asked them what are some of the reliability processes that should be in place within your organization or that relate mostly to reliability, and then you would then start asking some of these questions. You know, how does it impact your organization? How does it impact reliability of the grid? And so that's sort of the high-level process that you would sort of go through within that particular act. 1.2, we have perform reliability policy and related awareness. And so if you're looking at this particular sample for cyber vulnerability assessment program, you would look at that process and you would sort of ask yourselves, how is this program communicated? How is it documented? What are the policies, procedures that are used to perform this, the processes or controls within the cyber vulnerability assessment program? We have, for Act 1.3, define reliability objectives. Within the vulnerability assessment program, how are these objectives and or goals within the organization met and communicated? So really this would be taking your vulnerability assessment program, identifying those key objectives and goals within your organization as it deals with reliability. And you sort of map that up to, match that up with the cyber vulnerability assessment program to make sure that that part of the program is also successful. Another key aspect is define key reliability metrics. So you have objectives, and then what you try to do is you try to identify different metrics within your cyber vulnerability program to ensure that you can meet your objectives within your cyber vulnerability program within that particular process. And once again, this could be applied to several other different processes that are tightly related to reliability. So we have the second objective, which is identify gaps in reliability. So this is where you would look at some of those processes and you would assess those processes to identify gaps and try to determine what type of controls might need to be added or subtracted or improved upon. So Act 2.1 is hold internal audits and for objective evaluation. So in this case, maybe you would take a look at your cyber vulnerability assessment program and ensure that you're performing your cyber vulnerability assessment program well, making sure that any cyber assets within your program are being captured and are currently being scanned during that process, making sure that if you are mitigating the vulnerabilities, and you're doing that in some metric time frame. So if you have a high vulnerability or low medium or vulnerability, that you're getting those things accomplished and making sure that you're fixing things, fixing the vulnerabilities that are more risky, so to speak. Maintain systems for identifying and deploying internal controls. So this would be, how do you document the controls or policies or procedures within your cyber vulnerability assessment program? Also, potentially, how do you track the assets within that cyber vulnerability assessment program? How would you document all those different pieces and parts that you really need in order to have a successful cyber vulnerability assessment program? So if you look here, there's a couple examples. So what would be the type of system you would use to track vulnerabilities and mitigation of those vulnerabilities? What are some of the other types of controls in place to ensure the vulnerability assessment is getting done correctly? And then 2.3 is maintaining systems for validating procedures for grid reliability. So once again, this is ensuring that you have some process in place to ensure that whatever you've sort of set out within your cyber vulnerability program is getting completed. Making sure those results are recorded and written down and the processes are being followed. Objective 3 is monitoring reliability. So 3.1 is perform annual management process review for the system to validate processes including all stakeholders. So this is to ensure that the program is working effectively and that it's providing the needed output for stakeholders within the organization. So in essence, your cyber vulnerability assessment program would essentially be there to ensure that systems are not being compromised within your EMS, SCADA environments, and potentially even further out in the different type of cyber assets that may be outside of your ESP environment. And also help you improve the process as well. And so objective 4 is to correct reliability issues. When reviewing the cyber vulnerability assessment program, what are the things that you need to help correct and potentially improve your system? How do you identify root cause analysis and problem solving within the cyber vulnerability program? So this is to ensure that all those things that you might see within possibly a SIP audit, making sure those things you don't have those little gotchas within the SIP audit when you're showing some auditors what your cyber program looks like. So in some cases you may run into issues with not all the cyber assets were discovered. And so that may be a root cause that you need to have a better discovery process to ensure that you're covering all of your cyber assets within your vulnerability management program. 4.2 talks about providing reliability training program for organizations, including reliability and awareness. So this is more along the lines of ensuring that the people that are in charge and running the day-to-day processes within the cyber vulnerability assessment program are currently trained and understand what they're required to do from a responsibility standpoint. So we have a few questions from the reliability quality management practice area, and so the first one is what does an entity need to identify and assess to help specify a reliability management system? Another question would be describe how you validate your processes as they relate to the grid reliability. Third one is how often should you review your processes as they relate to grid reliability? And the fourth example is what is an example of process for creating reliability issues? So if you take a few minutes to answer those questions, and what we'll do is we'll discuss the answers to those questions. Okay, hopefully that was enough time. If not, you can possibly pause the WebEx and try to answer them yourself, but right now we're going to give the answers. So to question 1, what does an entity need to identify and assess to help specify reliability management system? Number 1 is really to identify your processes. You need to identify your processes within your organization and understand how they relate to reliability. This is one of the key issues when performing this type of assessment is really the scope and really understanding your business units, your processes, and the assets and how they apply to those processes and business units. And so the key here is really understanding your process as well and defining them. Question 2, describe how you validate your processes as they relate to grid reliability. And so the answer to that should be to perform an analysis as identified within Act 2.1 and 2.3. So ensuring that you have done a gap analysis either by a third party or internal audit function or even your own organization departments, and look through those processes and procedures within the Cyber Vulnerability Assessment Program, and then report on those gaps and either decide to make changes to the program or possibly add additional controls or procedures to help make it effective. Number 3 is how often should you review your process as they relate to grid reliability? Well, according to the specific activities, it's annually. So that's probably a good, healthy time frame to really review that process or those processes related to reliability from a quality management perspective. And then last, question 4. What is an example process for correcting reliability issues? And if you went through the specific acts within the reliability quality management area, you would see that a root cause analysis, problem solving, and/or additional training are all potential answers to this question to help correct reliability process issues. And so the next one Ellen will be doing, so I'll hand it off to her for measurement and analysis.
Thanks, David. I'll continue our review with the strategic initiative management practice known as measurement and analysis. Otherwise, we'll just call it MA. So MA is really looking at a list of measurable objectives or analysis methods from the previously mentioned management practice of reliability quality management. In MA, there are 4 objectives. So let's begin with the first one, which is specify key reliability metrics. In terms of our example of system restoration plan, we may be looking at metrics, some metrics that would be surrounding customer restoration times or time to restore the system to a pre-event status. For this metric, or this objective, we're looking for a metric that may be used to indicate how well the organization performed. Our second objective, we want to understand how the organization analyzes if they met their goals. For example, how does the organization know it's meeting their restoration goals? What information is gathered and how is it analyzed? What is considered an analysis? So for restoration, do we include all service interruptions or only service interruptions exceeding a certain time frame? We need to know the information that we're taking in. Our third objective is very straightforward. We're asking, how is the data collected? Is it consistent and measurable? Meaning, is the source of the data known, and is the source the same each time data is gathered? Is it repeatable? Our last objective for MA asks the user to draw conclusions and communicate the results. Are there certain actions that will be taken based on the results? And whom are the results being communicated to? For our example of the system restoration plan, we'd like to know, is there an event report? And if there is an event report, who is the event report distributed to, and what are the organizational expectations? We've concluded all 4 objectives in the measurement analysis, and now it's time to review with a couple questions. So we have 4 questions, 1 for each objective. The first is, describe measurable milestones within the system restoration plan. Second, describe some methods used to predict restoration time. 3, describe the process for collecting restoration time. And 4, describe how restoration times are communicated. Take a moment to pause this webinar and consider some answers, and we'll be back with you for discussion. All right, I hope you've had time to think about this. So for 1, where we're asking you to describe milestones within the restoration plan, this may be time to restore customers or time to return the system to a pre-event configuration or other. 2, we're looking for you to describe some methods used to predict restoration time. Restoration times may be predicted by identifying the failure mode. For example, a transformer or other equipment outage may have a predetermined length to restore. 3, describe the process for collecting restoration time. As mentioned before, equipment failures may be reported anytime during the restoration process and may come through field operations personnel who will develop plans and the time to replace the broken equipment, and then that handed up to a manager, a supervisor, manager, etc. But understanding that process and having a repeatable process is the key. 4, describe how restoration times are communicated. Restoration times may be communicated intercompany to provide status of the ongoing restoration efforts. I'll hand this over to David, and he can take us through risk management.
Thank you, Ellen. So within risk management, one of the first objectives is to establish a risk management process. So what are some of the first things you try to do within a risk management process? Well, within Act 1, the first thing is really to establish risk areas and objectives. So when you would look at your processes, you would first do an overall organizational identification of risk areas and objectives. So these would be high level within the organization. It's sort of an iterative process, so when you would actually perform these high level, identify these areas of high level areas and objectives, you would first try to identify those, and then you would go back to your processes and apply your different processes to those risk areas and objectives. So when you're looking at these different processes, and if you're going through an appraisal process that we would perform using the GRIPA model as we're showing here, you would try to identify, okay, you have these reliability processes. How does it relate to our organization's areas and objectives within risk? And so those are some of the things you'd have to try to identify within a process itself versus doing that whole entire risk analysis within your organization, identifying those risks. Act 1.2 is to establish a process to identify specific risks. So you would have those high-level areas and objectives for risk, and then what you would do is you would apply specific risks to those high-level areas and objectives. So, for instance, within the Cyber Vulnerability Assessment Program, what would be some of the specific risks that the Vulnerability Assessment Program would answer? So one thing that might be a high-level area objective, going back to 1.1, might be to ensure that your EMS and SCADA systems do not have any type of downtime longer than 15 minutes, because that's one of the NERC requirements to ensure that you have operational awareness. And so a more specific risk would be ensuring that the EMS and SCADA environments do not become breached and are highly available. And doing your cyber vulnerability assessment program can help you potentially fulfill that specific requirement or help mitigate that specific that risk. And then Act 1.3 establishes risk response. So this is essentially how do you respond to those different types of risks? What are some of the things you're doing to help mitigate or respond to the high-level risks that were identified in Act 1.1? Moving on to Objective 2, this is assessing the risk. So this is when we're looking at the specific processes that we're assessing, and more specifically to the Cyber Vulnerability Assessment Program. What would be the likelihood and impact of those vulnerabilities that are identified within the Vulnerability Assessment Program? So we're looking at more in the weeds a little bit at the vulnerabilities and risks that are identified and trying to understand or trying to come up with the likelihood and impact of those specific risks. So this may be more of a qualitative assessment with SMEs, basically doing like a high, medium, low, and some estimated time frames, or maybe you're using more of a qualitative approach that requires you to have a few calculations and using data from measurements analysis, just as Ellen has presented, and trying to come up with what is the impact of those specific risks. So then Objective 3 is mitigate the risks. Act 3.1 is mitigate and control the risks. So within the Cyber Vulnerability Assessment Program process, what we're looking at is what is being done with the resulted vulnerabilities that were assessed to identify their impact and possibly likelihood of the risks. And then we try to identify, okay, well, we have these risks. How do we mitigate them? Do we put controls in place? Do we put technology in place to help either prevent, detect, or correct these types of risks that are happening in the future? So that's the end of the risk management review. So now we have some more questions. The first one is, describe the process of how you identify risks and objectives to reliability. So once again, this is more at the high level space. In question 2, we have describe the 2 major methods of assessing risk. And question 3 is, what are different ways of mitigating and controlling risk? So once again, feel free to pause the webinar to answer the questions, and then come back and we will answer those questions and go through them together. Okay, well, we're back, and the first question was to describe the process of how you would identify risks and objectives to reliability. The answer to this question is risk to reliability may be identified by interviewing business unit personnel, conducting workshops to form analysis, or possibly other ways to get a group of people together and come to a consensus to identify those specific risk objectives to reliability. Question 2, describe the 2 major methods of assessing risk. So the answer to this question is qualitative versus quantitative. In some cases, a qualitative approach is more subjective and uses subject matter experts. A quantitative approach is more uses more of a more data-driven and has more of a mathematical input to it, sort of like what an insurance agent would use when you're applying your current risk as a driver. They actually use a lot of very well-defined formulas and use a lot of data to help come up with those specific types of risks, and they ask you a bunch of questions in the survey, and then they determine where you sort of fall within that risk. And then question 3, what are different ways of mitigating and controlling risk? And the answer to this is implementing preventative or detective or possibly corrective controls and or policies in ways that would mitigate the risk. So if you're implementing some sort of technology, it may be a preventative type of control, if it blocks things. Or if you're implementing a corrective control, maybe that's a forensic analysis tool to make sure that if you do suspect a breach, you have a way to sort of determine whether or not you were breached, and then you have a process in place to help fix those issues. So that's the end of risk management, and I will now turn it over to Ellen.
Thanks again, David. I'll continue our review of the strategic initiatives with the management practice of external interdependencies. External interdependencies, known as EXD, is really looking at the list of external resources which your company needs in order to maintain grid reliability. This management practice has 5 objectives, so we'll go through each objective. The first objective covers the need to identify and prioritize all external interdependencies. So back to our example of system restoration plan. We would need to identify all external interdependencies and then rank them. For our example, some significant external interdependencies may be, depending on the size of the disturbance and the restoration effort, we may be considering black start fuel, needing to ensure that the system can be black started, and or we may have a need for tree trimmers or linemen. And again, this is to ensure that the system can be restored. In Objective 2, we want to identify, assess, and mitigate the risks associated with any of these interdependencies that we previously identified. And finally, we want to manage the interdependencies in a longer-term view to reduce the risks as much as possible. For our system restoration plan, we've already identified the need for fuel, tree trimmers, and linemen. So during a disturbance, there may be additional risks that would cause those external interdependencies from not being realized. These are the risks that we need to have identified, mitigated, and managed. All right, Objective 3 says identifies the need for a structured relationship with the external interdependencies. This enables management of the external interdependencies. And Objective 4 says look at the performance of the external interdependencies and correct it if need be. So once you have a contract and terms in place for your external interdependencies, how do you ensure that the contractor is living up to their end of the deal? For example, did you get the fuel delivered on time? Did the tree trimmers and contract linemen adhere to the organization's safety rules? These might be things that you would look at. Finally, our 5th objective says reduce the risk of external interdependencies if and when possible. For our example of system restoration, it may not be practical to have enough fuel, tree trimmers, and linemen available and on staff for the worst event in history. But the organization over time should have a confidence of what to expect from fuel vendors, contract tree trimmers, and linemen, such that they know for a certain size event they have an expectation of when they can have their restoration complete. Again, let's review our external interdependencies. We have 5 questions, 1 for each example. Our first question, describe what external interdependencies could prevent you from restoring the system to a pre-event status. 2, what are some specific risks with external interdependencies and how can these be mitigated? 3, who in your organization manages contracts with external parties? 4, describe how vendor performance is monitored and improved. And 5, from a risk perspective, is it good to reduce external interdependencies? I'll give you a moment to pause the webinar and think about these questions, and we'll be back in a minute. All right, hopefully you have some good answers. So let's review. Question 1, describe what external interdependencies could prevent you from restoring the system to a pre-event status. Okay, risk to reliability may be identified by we have the wrong one there. Okay, describe what external interdependencies could prevent you from restoring the system to a pre-event status. As mentioned previously, this may be a lack of fuel for your black start, or you could not have tree trimmers enough to clear the lines, or you could not have enough linemen, the manpower, to restore the lines. So what are some specific risks with external interdependencies and how can these be mitigated? Some specific risks would be that you don't have contracts in place and you don't have sources for those external interdependencies. So there would be a need to have contracts in place to mitigate that risk and to know what to expect from your contractors. Who in your organization manages contracts with external interdependencies? This could be someone in your supply chain, but someone in your supply chain would need to understand the business unit needs, and there would have to be coordination to ensure that the right contracts and terms are put in place that would answer the business unit needs. Describe how vendor performance is monitored and improved. Again, your supply chain may manage those contracts, but they can only manage them if they have good input from the business unit and understanding the performance of the contractors. And 5, from a risk perspective, is it good to reduce external interdependencies? Yes, it would be good to reduce these external interdependencies. Analysis would need to be made to understand the cost benefit. Our next management practice is structured decision making. Take it away, Dave.
Thank you, Ann. So, structured decision making. This management practice is about ensuring that we have processes in place to make structured decisions on things that really do require to have some sort of decision made on that. So if you look at Objective 1, determine decisions that impact reliability. So once again, this is at the high level, and really kind of understanding, sort of asking that same question. Which parts of our processes or procedures would really kind of determine that we have to make a decision on? So for instance, you really wouldn't want to have to put a structured decision-making process around deciding what type of paper towels you have in your break room. It may be good just to lower costs, but that may not be a very useful a tool for you to determine that type of choice. The things we're kind of looking at is more along the lines, at least from a cyber vulnerability assessment program, and looking at that process. What are some of the criteria or some of the areas within that process that you would want to make decisions on? So, for instance, if you're going to be changing the process, you might want to have a good structured decision-making process in place. If you're going to be adding additional tools or technology that may require a large sum of money to purchase, you may want to put a structured decision process around that type of decision. So really, this is an identification process of ensuring we know what we want to make structured decisions around, as opposed to non-structured decisions. Objective 2 talks about establishing a decision environment. So in Act 1, we decided what we want to make decisions on. And then Objective 2, we create a process of some sort, a formalized process, to help us establish a decision-making process. So as you can sort of see in Act 2.1, establish guidelines for a decision analysis. And then 2.2 talks about establishing evaluation criteria. And so this is more along the lines of we want to determine what exactly we want to make decisions on and what type of measurement or analysis we would want to make, we would have to look at in order to make formalized decisions. Another thing is looking at the criteria and specifying certain criteria. From a first stab at this, maybe you look at cost. Maybe that's a criteria. If something costs additional amount of money, you want to try to make some sort of formalized decision on what is the cost-benefit analysis around that particular technology, or maybe a potential additional resource, things of that nature. Objective 3 is about deciding. So now we've come to the part where we identified what we want to do and what we want to make decisions on. We've made an analysis and came up with a good analysis approach. Now we're going to apply that analysis and start making formalized decisions on that analysis. So we talked about identifying alternative solutions. So basically, if you have multiple options, you may have to make a decision to pick either 1, 2, or 3 different solutions, or maybe just pick one of those solutions out of the things you're trying to assess. And then once you finally evaluate the method and you choose, and you look at the different solutions and create some sort of formalized process to sort of compare apples to apples instead of oranges to apples, to try to normalize the different options, it's now time to make a decision. So it's time for voting. This could be done with stakeholders. You could possibly look at different factors within the different options that you're making a decision on, and trying to ensure that you have a good way to sort of have that either a voting process or some sort of group consensus to make sure that the organization's heading down the right path. So once that decision process is completed, we have to record it and communicate it to the organization or the people that are involved or the stakeholders. So the Act 3.5 is really about ensuring that we write down that decision and possibly the justification for that decision, so that way if someone has questions about it later on, they can refer back to that formalized decision. So that's it for structured decision making. And here we go to the questions. And so first question is, within your organization, what criteria related to reliability is used to make decisions? Identify the assets or processes that may be affected. Question 2. What's an example of a process which is used to make decisions or decision analysis? And question 3. Describe the important last step in making a decision. So once again, feel free to pause the webinar and we'll come back with the answers. Okay, we're back. And for question 1, which is, within your organization, what criteria related to reliability is used to make decisions? Identify the assets or process that may be affected. For some of those examples, at least from the SIP environment, some things that you might want to make a structured decision around would be adding new network equipment, or maybe implementing a new EMS or SCADA environment. Another thing that you might want to take a look at when implementing a new and improved logical or physical security equipment, or maybe a badge access reader equipment. You're changing it over to a new system. Those are the types of things that you'd probably want to make formalized decision on. As you can sort of figure out, this kind of ties very much to the the reliability quality management practice area. So some of those processes that you identified in there would likely help you identify some of the areas that you'd want to make formalized decisions on. Question 2. What's an example of a process which is used to make decisions, or within decision analysis? So from a visual standpoint, one thing that is very popular, at least within Gartner, is the magic quadrant, where you gather information and you collect a bunch of data on different types of assets or different types of systems, such as like a firewall or possibly an IDS system, and then you grade them against each other. And you collect certain types of categories and figure out and do a bunch of research on the different types of assets. And then what you do is you then plot those points on what they call the magic quadrant, which is 4 quadrants. And generally the top right area is kind of like the magic quadrant, where you would generally want to make your decisions based on the types of vendor products that would be in that top right corner. Another one that's kind of similar to that is a heat map. Once again, you have to look at, you have to make a structured decision around data that you have collected over time and looking at the options to make a formalized decision. So those are some of the visual assessments that you possibly would use to help make decisions. And there are definitely other ones to help make formalized decisions. Number 3, describe the important last step in making a decision. And if you look back at the structured decision-making management practice area, you'd see that it's writing it down and communicating it. So that way we're not going back and sort of readdressing why did we make that decision, or possibly what was the final decision. So that way everybody's working from the same page. And I'll give this over to Ellen.
So in conclusion, we reviewed all 5 of the management practices that we consider part of our strategic initiative. These are really good examples of a continuous process, and as you can see from our illustration here, we've identified the objectives and activities associated with what we call define, measure, analyze, improve, and control. This is also known as a DMAIC methodology, meaning it allows for continuous improvement and control of a given organizational process. For grid reliability, this methodology this methodology is set up within our organization, and it lends itself for continuous improvement for many of our processes, such as emergency operations, transmission operations, generation maintenance, cybersecurity implementation, and cybersecurity validation. I'm sure you can reflect and think of many more applications for this, but thank you for being with us today, and we hope you've enjoyed learning about the Grid Reliability Strategic Initiative.